Hello again, everyone. Welcome to the Adult Sunday School lesson for October the 5th, 2025. It's an Old Testament lesson from the book of Habakkuk entitled Crying for Help. This is part of a new series of lessons for the month of October, which is entitled Wrestling and Watching. We're going to be looking at each lesson. We'll study how people have dealt with difficulties like pride, grief, anger, failures, and guilt in their life. Today it's crying for help. Next week it will be swallowing pride, then losing sleep, and then looking for peace, all during the month of October. I think we're going to find in these lessons that the key to being successful in our spiritual life is to live faithfully in and through the problems of our life. In other words, we're going to have problems. The trick is dealing with the problems within our current outlook about faith, trusting in the Lord, and not losing hope. Our lessons come from some familiar and some unfamiliar passages, such as today we're in the book of Habakkuk, which is hardly read, and I may have heard a handful of sermons in my entire life from this book. But today's text from Habakkuk tells of a person, Habakkuk, whose anguish led him to wonder if God had abandoned him. The experience of grief and frustration may grow into anger, bitterness, and even hostility if we allow it to do that. We have to find ways to address these negative feelings and keep them under control. The lesson that I got from this is that we should be grateful that God takes our misplaced anger and frustration when we're in the midst of these problems and sees it really as a cry for help. And it's a human tendency to cry out for help when we cannot help ourselves. And I believe God understands this to some extent. We're looking at this book of Habakkuk in the Old Testament. The word Habakkuk, or name Habakkuk, means to caress or embrace, put our arms around. The commentators say that perhaps Habakkuk, the baby, was dearly beloved by his parents, so they wanted to give him an appropriate name for that. Or perhaps they hoped that the adult Habakkuk would embrace God and the others who are living in the world, that this person would be a loving, caring person. So that is the hope and the thought behind the name Habakkuk. As far as the book of Habakkuk in our Bible is concerned, little background information. The main point, I believe, is that Habakkuk is arguing that God is not fair. From Habakkuk's point of view, he saw evil in the world prospering, and those that did not deserve to have evil in their lives were suffering. And from this, Habakkuk drew the conclusion that God's not faithful always in the world. The prophet, he's called a prophet. He's a person who spoke out, wants God to straighten out the Jews. He recognizes that the Jews have their problems of unfaithfulness, but they shouldn't be wiped off the map. That the punishment they were enduring was out of proportion to what they had done. Habakkuk lived in the south, the kingdom of Judah, and was troubled by all the sin that he sees about him. The funny thing about the book is that Habakkuk, the prophet, delivers no message to the people. It's not that he is a prophet to the people, but he delivers a prayer to God on behalf of the people. He receives a reply from God, but Habakkuk does not like the answer that God gives. And more than that, not just liking it, Habakkuk says so. He utters his disapproval back to God. So it's strange, one of the commentators has mentioned that it's strange that Habakkuk would even, the book of Habakkuk would even exist in the Old Testament prophecies, because he's not listed as a person who's standing on the street corner delivering God's message to the people. Rather, he is delivering a message to God for the people. It's a strange reversal of activity in this book. Habakkuk dared even to disagree with God. One commentator put it this way, you could paraphrase what Habakkuk says is, "You can't be serious, God. Evil men swallow up the righteous, and you stand around and watch and don't intervene." This is kind of the complaint that Habakkuk voices towards God. But his conclusion in the end is, our only activity is to trust God in the hardest of times, even when it looks like God is unfair or callous, doing nothing while good people suffer. We may get that impression that God is on the sidelines doing nothing, but that's because of our perverted perspective. If we had perfect insight and saw the whole picture from start to finish, we would look at things differently. And I'm going to share a poem written by Corrie ten Boom that kind of illustrates this point. So, the book of Habakkuk. Habakkuk is a prophet. He's not one of the major prophets. And by that I mean major. These are long books in the Bible. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. Certainly Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, those books are many chapters long, 60, 50, 40 chapters. The book of Daniel is a bit shorter, but it's still much longer than these minor prophets. Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. I've memorized those 12, so I can find them in the Old Testament, but they're not minor in their message. They are minor in the sense that they are short, only a few chapters. In fact, they're so short that all 12 of the writings could fit onto a single scroll. So in the way our Jewish brothers and sisters look at the scripture, they call these minor prophets the 12. The Baptist commentator on the book of Habakkuk says that he was a contemporary of Jeremiah, which was during an ominous period of time for Judah. The good King Josiah was dead, and evil reigned internally, and threats came externally. During this period, when Habakkuk and Jeremiah were prophesying, religion reached a new low, says the commentator. And Habakkuk was perplexed by these events. He wondered how God could allow injustice and wickedness to continue. So, with Habakkuk, we get the beginning of religious speculation in Israel and an argument back towards God that would continue in other wisdom literature and the wisdom tradition, perhaps even into Job. Though Job is an ancient text, one of the oldest we have, it deals with the idea of why bad things happen to good people in much the way that Habakkuk is complaining of. Here's an interesting modern discovery. Here is a 4.5 foot long scroll that is a commentary on the book of Habakkuk, discovered around 1949 among the Dead Sea Scrolls. You recall that these Dead Sea Scrolls, they form a sacred library that dates from the time of Jesus. So it wasn't contemporaneous with the writing of Habakkuk, which was hundreds of years before this commentary was written. But the interesting part about this commentary, it maintains that Habakkuk wasn't written about Babylon bringing problems to Judah only, but rather it also was a commentary on how the Romans were bringing problems to contemporary Jewish believers at the time of Jesus. And just as Babylon would be overthrown one day, so the Romans would be overthrown. So says this commentary on Habakkuk. That's the principle of the prophets. They were speaking to one time, but yet their message could apply to various other times, including our own day. So let us begin by looking at Habakkuk 1 through 4, which says, "The oracle that the prophet Habakkuk saw. O Lord, how long shall I cry for help, and you will not listen? Or cry to you violence, and you will not save? Why do you make me see wrongdoing and look at trouble? Destruction and violence are before me. Strife and contention arise. So the law becomes slack, and justice never prevails. The wicked surround the righteous. Therefore, judgment comes forth perverted." Wow, pretty dismal picture that Habakkuk describes. The prophet has seen his people Judah oppressed by Babylon for a long time. He knew they deserved correction, that is, the people had sinned and weren't as faithful as they needed to be, and deserved correction, even punishment, for their falling away from God due to their disobedience. But their punishment seems excessive, even to the point of destruction and death. Habakkuk then experiences God as absent, apathetic, or certainly not listening to the cries of the just. He asks, why should Judah obey God's laws if God doesn't care about them anymore? So, Habakkuk asks 3 questions. Is God really listening in the midst of our hurt? How much longer must we endure? Must we suffer the injustice we are experiencing? And when, if ever, will God balance the scales of justice for the oppressed? These are hard questions. For Habakkuk, God's seeming neglect for the people of Judah is counter to God's promises to Moses. The law of Moses indicated that they would prosper as they followed God, but that seems not to be the case. Habakkuk is exasperated and bewildered that God seems silent and distant in the midst of their problems. So Habakkuk comes to the conclusion that we must trust God even in uncertain times. Even though it's going against what we are experiencing right now, we must continue our faith in order to be rewarded in the long run. We have to express our faith that God's justice will prevail eventually. So that is the setup. Let us look at a furtherance of this discussion that occurs in the 2nd chapter of Habakkuk. I will stand at my watchpost and station myself on the rampart. I will keep watch to see what he will say to me and what he will answer concerning my complaint. This is Habakkuk talking about, I'm going to wait to hear what you say, Lord. Then there in verse 2, it says, Then the Lord answered me and said, Write the vision, make it plain on tablets, so that a runner may read it. For there is still a vision for the appointed time. It speaks of the end and does not lie. If it seems to tarry, wait for it. It will surely come. It will not delay. Look at the proud. Their spirit is not right in them, but the righteous live by their faithfulness. So Habakkuk complained. He asked for a reply, spoke up to God saying he would wait for a reply, and this is the vision that he received. He's standing on the rampart waiting for a reply from God to his just complaints. And God's reply took the form of a vision. And in this vision, God declared that the original covenant with Moses still stands. But it will be worked out in God's time. The end only seems to be delayed. The proud, the sinful, the selfish, they're sick in spirit and they don't have the wherewithal and the faith to wait for God's time for things to be accomplished. But the righteous will express their faithfulness and cling to that rather than to human misunderstanding or conventional wisdom that does not see the whole picture. It's very easy when we get stuck in our own individual limited points of view not to see the big picture of what's happening. So things may be worsening for the people of Judah through no fault of their own, through their unfaithfulness and through the invasion of foreign countries, but God is still at work to bring about God's plan in God's time. I wanted to, in my lessons, I typically give a comment from a New Testament scholar when we're in the New Testament, but since we're in the Old Testament, I wanted to introduce, I mentioned before, Clyde T. Francisco, who was a longtime pastor and professor at Southern Seminary. And he wrote this book, Introducing the Old Testament, which is a great introduction to all of the books of the Old Testament, which I treasure in my library, and I read from it frequently when I'm looking at an Old Testament text. So for these Old Testament texts, I wanted to see what Dr. Francisco says about Habakkuk's text. He says, with Habakkuk, a new note appears in prophecy. His utterances are different from his predecessors. They addressed the people on behalf of God. Habakkuk addressed God on behalf of the people. God's answer comes to Habakkuk, and that answer is, evil is by its very nature self-destructive. Evil will never prevail, even without divine intervention. But the righteous live by their faith. That alone will be sufficient to sustain them even through periods of disagreement, periods of hurt in this life. Evil may seem to prosper for a while, But the righteous, those who are filled with faith, have a permanent life regardless of the situation that they're in. Wow, what a wonderful comment that is. These lessons in October are blended lessons in terms of they're coming from two Old Testament texts based on the lectionary readings for the day or week. And they're from different parts of the Old Testament. And I have a hard time drawing a single conclusion between these two portions of Scripture. So I'm taking this opportunity to go in a little bit more depth into one of the Scriptures and not look at a completely different Scripture for these lessons in October. For that reason, I have an opportunity to say a little bit more about Habakkuk. So that's what I mean by the rest of the story. There is an apocryphal book, that is, our Catholic friends have a different Old Testament than we have. They have a series of books that are not in the Protestant Bible. One of these apocryphal writings is called Bel and the Dragon, which is actually 42 additional verses to the book of Daniel. And in this book, Bel and the Dragon, it claims that Habakkuk carried pottage or a meal to Daniel while Daniel was suffering in the lion's den. Can you believe that? It seems that Habakkuk may have been the first Uber driver or the first DoorDash deliverer of food. Another such work, apocryphal work, claims that Habakkuk died 2 years before the return from exile. So Habakkuk lived through the oppression that he was complaining about, was part of the exile, but did not live to see the return from exile. And he needed to have his faith restored. Habakkuk is also mentioned by a Christian writer named Eusebius, who was the secretary, the church secretary to Constantine in early Christian times, and he wrote a history of the Jewish religion and the Christian religion. And he says that Habakkuk's tomb was both at Gilbo and Keilah. And it's a curious inconsistency that he would have two tombs. But anyway, I wanted to mention that this is not the only place that Habakkuk's name appears. Here's an image that I saw of Habakkuk in the lion's den with Daniel. That's narrated in Bel and the Dragon, which is in the Catholic Bible, but not in the Protestant Bible. This writing says that Habakkuk brought this pottage or wheat or gruel or whatever the food was, but he brought that food to Daniel. It was miraculously transported there like an Uber vehicle, and then left his food and was miraculously brought back and returned home by God's Spirit after he had helped Daniel. I wanted to mention Corrie ten Boom. Here's a picture of Corrie. She is famous for, she's featured in many of the Billy Graham crusades that I watched when I was growing up. Watched them on TV, and she was famous for the hiding place, how she took it upon her to, she lived through World War II and hid many Jewish persons who were condemned to go to concentration camps, but she hid them from the Nazis and was very active. Her book, The Hiding Place, describes some of those activities. But she wrote a poem about, "My life is but a weaving between my God and me. I do not choose the colors, he worketh steadily. Oft times he weaveth sorrow, and I in foolish pride forget he sees the upper and I the under side. Not till the loom is silent and the shuttles cease to fly will God unroll the canvas and explain the reason why The dark threads are as needful in the skillful weaver's hand as the gold and silver colors in the picture he has planned. He knows, he loves, he cares. Nothing this trust can dim. He gives the very best to those who leave the choice to him. So, the issues for us today are we must not let the pain we feel at life's disappointments and tragedies push us over the edge into despair and doubt. It's only human to feel that God has left us when we are hurting. From this passage in Habakkuk, I hope we learn that God is not offended by our honest prayers of hurt and requests for help in our need. As we wait on God's timing, we need to understand that we do not see the whole picture, and it takes faith to do so. Well, thanks for joining me today. Please don't take me too seriously as I talk about what these passages might or might not mean, but do look at the scripture, read it seriously, and study it. The lesson is presented only for education, entertainment, exhortation. There's no commercial value intended. Please do lift up those prayer concerns that we know of in our church body. And I hope to see you next week as we continue this study of Old Testament passages which help us deal with some of the problems that we encounter in life. Thank you, Daryl, again for your faithfulness in producing, directing, troubleshooting these sessions that are loaded to YouTube. Thanks again, Daryl. Till next week, I will say goodbye.